Welcome everyone to the 2026 Torrance Festival of Ideas. My name is Anna Abraham. I am the director of the Torrance Center for Creativity here at UGA. And the 2026 Torrance Festival of Ideas this is the sixth time that we're doing this. It is run and organized by the Torrance Center for Creativity, which was founded 40 years ago. Um, for the University of Georgia, and is dedicated to the study of creativity. I'm very thankful to my team who has helped make all of our events and initiatives happen. A special thanks to Desiree Sharp and Tabitha Menish, as well as our team of student assistants for this event in particular. I thank three of them, and in particular, Anna Williams, who helped set this up. Now, this year's festival explores the theme of creativity and AI, and it comes at a time when I think we were eager to do this topic, but wanted to wait for a little bit till there was enough scholarship and enough of us familiarizing ourselves with what it means to use AI in the context of creativity to run a really interesting festival. When we think about AI in the context of creativity, what we're talking about really over the next 2 days is generative AI. So one aspect of AI, because that's where it's talked about the most in the context of creativity. So just for some reference, the first, let's say, publicly accessible generative AI tool, ChatGPT, was released in November 2022. So it's about over 3 years in now since you've had this tool. There's a lot of scholarship now on what it means to use these tools, and you have a variety of opinions on a continuum that start from one hand, which is we should embrace it, it's here to stay, to the other hand, which is that we should be quite skeptical of what it allegedly does and what it does to our skills. Now, in the case of creativity, then the kind of words you will see from one of these approaches would be to see AI tools as a kind of the words you see are collaborate, co-creating, partner. And this I would put on one end of the continuum, which is really an approach of embracing it. Yes. And on the other side, you have words like de-skilling, cognitive offloading, cognitive surrender is one I came across this month in an article in the New York Times written by Ezra Klein. And this is on the other end of the continuum, which is more of an approach just that says we should resist these tools, right? So it's a really interesting time to be talking about creativity in the context of using AI in service of creativity. We might differ a lot in terms of where we fall on the spectrum of embracing and resisting, but I thought what would be really useful for all of us is to get a range of expert perspectives that vary along this continuum and tell us about how they think about it, where they see the value in it, or where they don't see the value in it. So we have a really exciting lineup of speakers here, 12 speakers across 4 sessions in 2 days. And we have the morning session, we have 3 speakers, Rosha Wingstrom, Daniela Grieco, and Francesco Fedele. They will speak each individually, one after the other. There'll be a short Q&A after each session for each, so you can pose your questions to each speaker then. This will be followed by a panel discussion at the end with 2 moderators, Dr. Kimberly Van Orman and myself, where we will engage with the speakers with what we've heard. Again, please, we really count on the audience to sort of join in the discussion. Please do not feel inhibited at all in doing so. So we'll start this off now with session 1. I'm absolutely delighted to present our first speaker. I will stop sharing so that she can share her screen with you. I will just do a brief introduction first. So Rosha Wingstrom is a postdoctoral researcher in regional studies at the School of Management within the University of Vaasa in Finland. She completed a PhD in economic geography, where her thesis was on creativity in the digital age. So scholarly expertise lies in the domain of geographies of innovation, knowledge, and creativity. Dr. Wintram is particularly interested in the diverse ways that technology mediates human life, so from everyday activities all the way to global dynamics. Um, Her work caught my attention when I'll highlight two of them in particular. One is an article she wrote for the Creativity Research Journal in 2024, which was on redefining creativity in the age of AI, where she interviewed Finland-based scientists and media artists, so two different types of creative outputs, and looked at the similarities and differences in the way they use AI in their work. And the second paper, which is more recent, that came out in the journal Culture and Organization in 2025, focused on studying moments of encounter and immobilities or mobilities in the artist creative process. So her talk title is Can AI, a bracketed, be creative? And she talks about human and non-human actors in the creative process. We're delighted to be able to feature her and her work here. Thank you so much, Rosa.
Thank you for this lovely introduction, and nice to meet you all. I'm very honored to start this event. So yeah, I think Anna's introduction covered most important parts. But yes, my name is Rosa. I'm a PhD or a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vaasa. And just let me know if the slides don't change. Now you should see a short about me. So yes, I obtained my PhD last year in economic geography. And if you're wondering now, what does geography have to do with all of this? I will get into that a bit later. So keep that in mind. So yeah, currently I work as a postdoc in the School of Management. So I've been interested in these kind of technological mediating effects in organizational and social processes. And in my PhD, I focused on creativity in particular, like Anna said. So I studied kind of these creative work environments and individual work processes. And then I wanted to look at how technologies, especially AI, affect those processes. And actually, currently, I'm a visiting scholar at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where I'm working in more on the sustainability studies side, where I'm interested in how technological mediation affects knowledge sharing and creation in these sustainable urban planning processes. So again, kind of different context, but still my focus lies on this kind of diverse ways that technology mediates our lives, and especially these social processes such as creativity or knowledge sharing. Since I have the pleasure of being the first speaker, I would like to begin with some definitions or to kind of create a common ground for understanding what does creativity mean, and then again, what does AI mean? So if we begin with creativity, maybe you can write down in the chat. I'm not sure if I can see, but I would like everybody to just throw in some thoughts. What does creativity mean to you? How do you see it in your own life, or how do you maybe see it in the world in general, or in your work, or whatever, however you feel. If someone who sees the chat can, I don't know if Anna or Desi was available to read this. Maybe you could read them out loud since I don't seem to be able to. Oh, can I open the chat? Oh,
I
I
Yeah, if you want. Would you
yeah.
want to open the chat yourself, or do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, I got it open now. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect.
So yeah, so I see already a few comments. Um, such nice ones there is someone says it's transformation that can touch my heart. Creativity is the breath that keeps me alive, the place where we have the courage to share the new and useful solution, novelty, imagination, taking risk, interaction, problem solving, expressing ideas. Another problem solving, being able to see possibilities, put together different ideas, being active in the world, an idea that adds value. Yeah, thank you. So many different definitions, or I don't know if we can call it definition if it's something that you experience in your life. Like, of course, it's a because there is, I think, important when we talk about big concepts like creativity that there is often this kind of standard definitions in academia, but then there is always the individual experience. And I would like to think that our individual perception of something is never wrong. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for sharing your ideas. I think all of these are absolutely true, and I think creativity from a like research perspective is really interesting because, like I said, seems to be these standard definitions that we aim to achieve or we use as our like theoretical standpoint. But then it's at least from my experience, creativity is something that really just is in my life. It's not something that I necessarily need to define on myself. Like I just know that I have the capability of being creative, or I see creativity around me in many things. So it's been a pleasure to work with such a concept that has so many nuances. But since we are in this academic context, I think it's nice to try to aim for some definition that kind of, I don't know, maybe frames the conversation, but it doesn't mean that there is just one perspective. But I discovered while doing my PhD that this often comes from creativity research, which originates in psychology, that common definitions tend to define creativity as an ability. So it's an ability often connected to humans. So ability to create something new, valuable, and or unique. And these adjectives, new, valuable, unique, are then used to evaluate kind of the outcome that we created. But of course, like I write here, it's important to understand where does this definition come from, because there has been many definitions over time, and our kind of perception of creativity is always changing. So it doesn't mean that this has to be kind of the way of seeing creativity in individual life, but maybe from the academic standpoint, it's useful. And then another important definition that I think we should try to make is AI, since it's the other big concept used in this event this year. And of course, like now, like Anna also mentioned in the introduction, this is a very timely topic. It's been discussed in length because often I see this connected to creativity in this kind of new era or transformative way. So kind of that AI is changing this, that now when we discuss creativity and we discuss what it means in our lives, so does AI have the capacity to kind of transform these emotions or experiences we have of creativity? And to even start to unpack this, I think we really need to understand what AI is or what we mean by AI when we talk about this phenomena. And I, again, from coming from academic background, I try to use commonly used definitions when I write or when I talk in public, because then it gives this kind of understanding that can be kind of academically shared. But again, this doesn't mean that AI has to be understood only through this. And I would argue that many computer scientists or AI scientists would not even agree with this definition. But here in European Union, we try to define AI for policymaking, and therefore this definition is often used that says AI means systems that display intelligent behavior by analyzing their environment and taking action with some degree of autonomy to achieve specific goals. So there are many things going on there, but I think kind of these buzzwords that you can take from there are intelligent behavior or display intelligent behavior. So again, like something that we as humans perceive intelligent, and AI has capacity to analyze the environment. So that means like taking some input and then making it into outputs. And then often this degree of autonomy is mentioned because then it's thought that what makes it intelligent is that it has some level of autonomy, or it can make kind of decisions on its own. But again, we could argue what is autonomy in this sense, because these models are, of course, built by humans who have designed them to work in a certain way. But autonomy in this sense, at least to my understanding, means that there is not necessarily predetermined objectives. So the objective or the outcome is kind of forming along the way when the AI makes the decisions to achieve these goals. So yeah, but now enough of the definitions, and let's get into the actual topic. So what do these two things mean together? When I started to study this kind of the creativity of AI together, I immediately discovered that even though for the past years it sounds a lot like this is something totally new and we have never seen this before, it's like unprecedented. But actually, computational creativity is not that new, and this might be, at least for some people, kind of a relief to understand that this is not some drastic change that has happened over just a few years, because computation and arts have really a long history together, and it was really nice to delve into this topic. And I'm not going too much into historical part of this arts and creativity and computation kind of relationship. But when we talk about creative AI, we can actually find out that there has been creative AIs around since 1950s, because computer scientists have always been interested in kind of making these cognitive processes and replicating them in machines. So of course, creativity has long been understood as a very important cognitive process for humans. So then it has been studied in this computational sense as well. And one example is this machine called Aaron by Harold Cohen. He was a computer scientist who is often seen as the kind of or the creator of the earliest artificial intelligent program for art making. And this is, I don't know if it's still there, but at least there was some model of Aaron in an exhibition at Whitney Museum of American Art. So this was already done, I believe, in 1950s or 1960s. And of course, like our understanding of if this is creative can be debated, but back then it was like considered very groundbreaking that this model could even draw on its own. But yeah, we have come a long way since then. And kind of when I'm talking about this new era of creativity, I think it's important to understand which AI models we are talking about. And I think over the past 2 years, like Anna also mentioned, ChatGPT, this generative AI has become this hot topic. And I think this is the driver of this new era of creativity. So these generative AI models are seen as something completely different from these past models, because they can generate new content with just when people write a few prompts, and then suddenly you have a new picture or new piece of music and so on. So then this, of course, has changed a lot of things in many fields, like creative fields or in life in like general, because now these models are accessible to the public. They are not just some secret models in some computer science labs. They are just out there in the internet, and you can just find that new models are coming, or new software or new platforms are coming up every day. And then because of that, because of this large scale of AI generated content, we have started to question important things like who is actually the creator in this sense. Like, is it the people who have modeled this, for instance, ChatGPT or whatever, like Midjourney image generating models, or is it then the people whose work has been used to train these models, or is it the person who can come up with some creative prompt to make this? And there are a lot of different actors in this process. And then when we come to the ethical questions and copyright, of course, there are so many questions that still remain unanswered. Like we don't have kind of the ethical questions figured out. We don't have the legal questions figured out. So all of this is just still kind of out there. And I think it's important for us researchers to try to find different kind of ways to look at this without, or at least from my perspective, is then Anna asked in the beginning, like, do we want to embrace or resist this? I don't see it really, or it doesn't have to be so black and white, but I would like to, before kind of, I don't know, advocating for either solution, I would like to understand this process a bit more. And I would say the question maybe in that what kind of guided my work initially was based on all these topics that just came out after this generative AI or when it was still in development. By the way, that was also an interesting time to write my PhD thesis and do my research because I started in 2020, and when I finished in 2025, a lot had changed over that period. So I kind of was right in the middle of this change that was going on thanks to the new ChatGPT or GPT models. But yeah, the question that initially drove me was this: could AI have creative agency, or could AI be creative? And then what would it mean for our creative processes as people? And then another question was, how do we study this issue? And this, again, like I mentioned, turned out to be quite difficult because the idea of creativity has always changed. If we go back to history again briefly, we would find that before the Enlightenment era, creativity was considered to be this skill of gods, or kind of only special humans could kind of tap into this creative power of gods, and that would drive us insane, as the philosopher Socrates, for instance, thought. So then again, I first had to like begin from something like, how do I define creativity in my work? And of course, I can then go to the creativity research of psychologists or creative research scientists who have done this work from the cognitive perspective. So they have looked into the cognitive processes our brains go through when we are doing creative tasks or things that we perceive as creative. So when we try to find new solutions or solve problems, we have certain divergent and convergent thinking skills that are going on in our brain. So we could try to define creativity from that perspective. And then many computer scientists try to do this. So, what if AI can learn to replicate these processes? Because in the end, often brain is seen as this sort of very intricate biological machine. So why could not we just replicate those in a machine? And if we can we say that, okay, this model is creative because it's doing exactly what our brain would do in this process? Yeah, so often in computational creativity, there is like certain steps of these cognitive processes. Because let's say creativity involves like this ideation, and then testing out different ideas, and then execution, and then kind of producing the final product. So computational creativity scientists often try to mimic either this entire process or aspects of this process. And then another perspective in creativity studies is often used this kind of focus on the outcome. So if we see as an audience an outcome, like let's say a beautiful painting or even like a scientific breakthrough, and we considered it to be creative, can we argue that, okay, this is something that must be something creative because society kind of recognizes it as creative? And then what if we learn that this painting was done by AI? Does it somehow diminish its creativity? And does it then matter who made it if this kind of wider perspective or societal perspective already deems it novel or valuable or whatever? And this also, if we just focus on these outcomes instead of the process itself, we can evaluate not only human-generated outputs, but of course AI generated outputs as well. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, and also some of you mentioned in your perceptions of creativity, if something is novel and valuable, it can be considered creative. So, what if AI creates something valuable or novel, or is it then already not novel because it's done by AI, because it's kind of mimicking the work of past artists or whose content has been used? But then the counterpoint to that is like how often we as humans create something completely out of scratch. Like we have also kind of learned from the past to create new things. So how different are we from that? And I'm not trying to say that there is one solution to this, but I'm just I was maybe surprised when I did this work to kind of find out how many different things there was to consider and how many of these philosophical questions is actually really difficult to answer with like simple yes or no. And then, especially coming from economic geography, I was kind of, or the framework where I was operating was really focusing on this innovation aspect of creativity because creativity is associated with this innovation capacities of individuals and organizations or even regions. So we value creativity not only because it's important for us as people, but because it really creates societal value or economic value. And then AI coming to this is often seen as maybe in a positive light because it can at least increase productivity or increase maybe, I don't know, bouncing ideas or like brainstorming. So then if creativity or AI can boost creativity in this way, it often is considered to be something to be embraced. But then, after considering all these aspects in my PhD, I kind of went back to this very geographical way of thinking, which, if you're familiar with especially human geography, we like to look at things from these processual or process perspectives, where we consider the space and time and material aspects of whatever is going on in the world. It can be anything from large scale processes to even individual ones, like I did in my research. So I went back to this theoretical perspective and I wanted to look at the creative work of the individuals that I then ended up studying from this perspective. So, but where are they and what they are doing and with what tools when they are being creative? And this then brings me to this kind of interactions between technology and humans, because I think that when we look at this, what happens in the interaction, we can actually learn more about not only how the technology functions and operates in our creative work, but also how we ourselves are creative and how, or at least to my opinion, this explains creativity much better than any single cognitive model could ever do. Because I don't think creativity can be necessarily trapped into this only from A to B to C process. And instead, I think, at least, well, this mixes a bit with my personal perspective, but also what I think we can say from geographical perspective, that it's really a lifelong process that continuously evolves. And it evolves when we interact with environment and the tools we are working with, and then with each other. So I think for me, it would be if I think of, let's say, the creative process of making my PhD, it would be really redundant to even try to kind of put it into this like, okay, yeah, in that aspect I was creative, or in this one moment I felt creative, or like this outcome is the creative thing that came out of this. Or I think it was more like the overall thing, and that involves so many different people and places and tools that I can't even just put it into one specific moment. So just briefly about the actual empirical findings, I did interview over 50 creative workers, half were from arts and half were from sciences, to kind of create this comparison between different types of creativity. And of course, like some people might think that there are two different, or that science is not so creative, but I would argue that both of these professions or professionals try to achieve something novel in their own respective fields. So that's why it was really interesting to compare these. And actually, what I learned like really quickly after interviewing these people was that the question whether the AI is creative becomes irrelevant, because when the participants talked about this when they were using AI, and I must say at that stage where I was interviewing them, not many were using generative AI. So this was more about AI in general, like some models that would some at least some of their working processes, or would speed up some of their working processes. So again, there is not necessarily a focus on generative AI when they spoke about AI. But in any case, no matter what type of AI was in question, the participants emphasized these things that the AI tools brought to this work. And often it was something related to developing new ideas or breaking patterns of old working processes, or even just speeding up some analytical processes. And then I understood that instead of trying to see if the AI was being creative in that process, I should rather understand what even is the creative process and how the creativity actually emerges from these encounters between the people and the tool, and maybe even the environment they were in at any given moment. And then in the conclusion part of my PhD, I kind of related to this back to this, like how do we perceive creativity in our society? And what I also found based on the empirical part of my PhD was that many people, when I was asking them like, when is it, or do they find it difficult to be creative in their work? And many people found that the constant hurry, or if they don't really have time to stop and think and ideate things, like really affects negatively their work. And that, in my opinion, relates to this societal pressure to always be productive and fast in what we do. And we don't really seem to have time to just ponder or just mindfully observe our environment. For instance, I realized this because I had really long commute from my home to the University of Vasa. I spent hours and hours on train, and I began to notice that train or being in the train was really important to me. I was always looking forward to it. I was like, oh, finally I can go to the train. And because often the internet connection was so poor, I was like, I don't even have to work, or I can't even like, message my friends. I just have to be in the train and I can just read or look out of the window. And I realized that might be the only moment in my life when I actually have time to just look out of the window and just think about things without any specific goal. And I think if our society is kind of taking those moments away from me, we are getting, or we are losing something fundamental in the creative process. And this is important because the creativity or creating new things is not about the moment of creation or the outcome, but it's about all these steps that are equally important. And so I guess my takeaway from my PhD and all of this creativity with AI is that I encourage everyone to ask from or ourselves or yourselves, when you're using these tools, no matter if it's AI, but it can even be any tool, can I be creative with this tool? And how does this tool support my creativity? And if we find that it's not really supporting it, then I don't know why we should be using it for creativity. And I'm not saying this to say that AI could not support your creativity, because I have seen from my empirical examples that it definitely can. But I think it requires us to think about it first, like really be mindful about what in what way are we using this tool? And if it's a generative AI, and if we're using just to be more productive or trying to be more fast, or even then filling this gap when we would finally have time to generate new ideas ourselves, and we are just using AI to do that, then my question would be, how does that actually support your creativity? Because to me, it seems that not so much. But that is something every individual, I think, has to figure out themselves. Like, what is the best way for them to use AI or any other tool? I always like to conclude with, when I talk about creativity and AI, with this quote from the article by Colton and Wiggins from 2012, where they wrote beautifully that the artifact resulting from a creative act should be seen as an invitation to engage in a dialogue with the artifact and the creator and the culture and yourself. So I think this time in or this moment in time when we are talking about AI and creativity, and we are seeing different AI models being used in creative work, I think we should see these models exactly like this, as an invitation to understand our own creativity better, because I think we can really learn something valuable from it also. So yeah, I hope I stayed in the 30 minutes, and I thank you. And if you have any questions now, I suppose we have a few minutes for this.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosha. Can wait. I was going to say, if there are questions for the speaker, please put it in the chat window. If you'd rather ask yourself, please use the raise hand function. Could you stop sharing your screen, Rosha, so that
Yes.
everyone can see you? Okay, great. Oh wow, I've not seen this version of Zoom, so so maybe we can start with a question. Kimberly, do you have one that you want to
Sure.
pose?
Yeah. Something that I was curious, because we often talk about creativity as a skill. Do you think that the people that you were studying who were using AI as a tool for creativity are the kind of
Mm,
people that would always find a new tool as the
mm,
inspiration for their creativity? Or was there anything about the AI itself that would, like, right, this is the old like fear of improvisers, that you're going to be given things and being told be creative with it. But there are
mm,
people who seem to, like, anything they pick up is going to be an inspiration
mhm.
for their
Yeah,
creativity. Or was there anything about the AI itself that seemed to be adding?
yeah. Yeah, I think there was, especially comparing artists and scientists, it was quite clear. Artists, I would say, more often saw it as this kind of tool that they just felt that it's a kind of new method of doing things, especially if it was not generative AI, but it was just some sort of, let's say, like some of them were using some sort of audio model. I can't now remember like what it was, but it was some audio visual type of model that would, like, detect your movements or bodily movements and then turn that into music or something. It was really interesting, but I don't know if it was necessarily based on generative AI. So I would say from that perspective, at least back then, it was definitely so that the artist maybe related it to, like, they often said, this is like a paintbrush to me. I can just pick up a paintbrush and do something new with it. And I guess the scientists more often saw the utility value of it. They were kind of like saying, oh, because AI can do this specific function in this work, I'm using it. So there was different ways of seeing it. But yeah, like maybe if your question, like whether the AI was, because I don't know, again, this is like what is creativity? Like, if creativity is that we utilize any tool in a way that achieves the goal we're wanting to achieve, then I would say, yeah, it is part of the creativity. But I don't know, could it be any other tool? Maybe not. So maybe if I understood what you were referring, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. People.
I can't see any raise. Are there any questions? Please put them in the. We have about 4 minutes left for questions directly for Rosha. I'll ask one. I think I was interested in what you ended the talk with, which was
Mhm.
that which was almost like hell, the more reflective way of using it, which
Mhm.
is what is it helping me discover about
Mm.
how does it embed my discovery process and creativity. And I was wondering whether, when you answer the question to Kimberly, it sounded to me that the artists and scientists are using it quite differently. So could you just sort of go over some of the similarities and differences in the way these two creative
Yeah.
groups use these tools? Like, in what way are they
Yeah.
similar and what way are they different?
Well, artists often maybe used it to not necessarily, they didn't have a specific goal in mind necessarily, like they were not trying to like of course as artists like they often see this like art making is not just that they have a clear vision of something and then I'm trying to do that and I have clear steps to do it, but rather kind of learning how to do that with the AI or seeing how the AI maybe reacts or what you can actually do with it and testing out new things, or was maybe the kind of main point for the artist. Whereas for scientists, it was like they often had this very specific goal, like I really need to achieve this. So how can I use this AI to do that? So it was more kind of like, I don't know, way of like seeing the outcome of the process. But of course, that's affected by their work. Like scientists need to produce these things. They need to come up with good solutions so that they can publish the paper. They want to like show that this model works or whatever. And for artists, it's not so important to get to one specific place in their work, but rather just to see what different things they could do. So that was interesting, but I wouldn't say either of those like ways of working is better than the other. It's just very different, and it just shows how much technology can do or shapes the process itself. Because sometimes the artists would say that maybe they had some way they wanted to go, but then the AI didn't work that way, and it actually turned into a complete new direction what they were trying to do. And yeah, and they just went with it. They were like, okay, I'm free to follow this route instead, because I'm kind of this technology points me to this way. And of course, for scientists, then it was different. If something didn't work, it was not good. They were not happy with it. So it's sometimes blocked their kind of creative work in the sense that if the technology did not work as expected, it did not, or it kind of hindered their creative process. So there was many different effects. And yeah, but of course, for me, it's hard to say like if AI itself is kind of this, because I don't know, it can often, or I was often thinking like, could this be just any tool? Like, what is exactly the difference between Paintbrush and AI? And but then the answer may be because we are now thinking how big of an impact does AI have, at least from this perspective, if we can still kind of see that these different tools have different impacts in our creative work, but they don't fundamentally change what we're doing, doesn't fundamentally change the creativity. I wouldn't say AI, at least from that perspective, is a threat to our creativity. Yeah, that was a
Yeah.
long answer to a short
Yeah.
question. But yeah, thank
We
you.
love long answers. Thank you so much. Okay, but it's just in time. It's 9:45. So thank you so much,
Mhm.
Rosha, for your wonderful presentation. If you could have more questions for Dr. Wingstrom later, you can
Mhm.
bring it to the panel discussion. We'll move now to our second speaker, who is going to be Dr. Daniela Greco, who I have the pleasure of introducing now. So Daniela Greco is an associate professor in economic policy in the Department of Law at the University of Milan. She completed a PhD in economics at the Università Bocconi in Milan in Italy, and her research looks at a range of different things: social interactions and collective action games, individual and group decisions in context of risks and risk and ambiguity, financial incentives in shaping individual and corporate behavior, guilt aversion, fairness and norms, and of course, creativity and innovation, which is why we were excited to invite her to this. Two of her works, recent works, really came to our attention that made us so happy that she agreed to speak here. One was a paper that came out in the Economic Journal this year, which is Creativity and AI, where they investigate the performance of AI systems relative to humans in creative tasks. And they brought up a concept which I don't think anyone else has discussed, which is task openness. So I'm excited to see what she has to say about that here. And also a wonderful other paper that came out in 2022 in Economic Letters on creativity and ambiguity tolerance, where they showed that exposure to creativity may engender higher openness to ambiguity and novelty, which is kind of different from the way psychologists approach it, which is sort of openness leads to creativity, whereas they were saying actually just exposure to creativity might make people more open. So she comes from a really interesting approach that we rarely get to showcase. We're so pleased that she's here. Dr. Grieco will be talking to us on the topic of imagination unplugged, why humans still outcreate AI.
Okay, so thank you very much, Anna, and hi, everybody. So I'm going to share my slides immediately. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so again, thank you very much for the invitation. And what I'm trying to do today is giving you the perspective of an economist, as I am. In particular, I'm a behavioral economist, and I typically run experiments, economic experiments. I will be a bit more precise on how we do that while describing the experiments I will be talking to you. The key aspects of the talk today will be about the paper that Anna mentioned, the one on the Economic Journal about creativity and AI. I will present you the result of that set of experiments. And here in the title, you already have a kind of spoiler of what we do find, which is the key role of human imagination in having humans outperform AI machine in creativity tasks. So let's see a bit more what happens in our experiments, and somehow let's try to start from the beginning. So I'm trying to go on with the slide, but apparently, okay, now it works, sorry. Okay, so economists study decisions, so it's exactly what I do, and Anna was mentioning some of the decision I've been studying in my years of research. Typically, they use a combination of theory and data. In particular, when we have to go deep into a decision process, we tend to use experiments because they somehow help understanding exactly how people engage with the task and all the details that are a bit difficult to observe when you just have data without being able to follow the whole process. In particular, I have to say that economic experiments in creativity were quite rare 10 years ago when we started working on that. And the topic of creativity was a bit of exotic. So economists were really interested in innovation, so somehow the application of creativity, but less in the creative process because it was considered a bit more a domain explored by psychologists. And so my co-author, Gary Charnes, and I tried to address this gap, to contribute to this gap, by starting working about creativity. And what I can say about what is happening now with the popularity of all the artificial intelligence machines and the fact that everybody is basically using them is that in terms of creativity, in my opinion, they have brought again attention to the creative process because everybody was scared of being substituted by AI. And so what would become crucial is distinguishing between different types of tasks. So it's clear that for routine tasks, AI is very good and may probably substitute some part of human contribution in what is just repetitive and standard. But for what concerns creativity, it's a bit more complex. And of course, we have to understand in which sense creativity can be challenging for AI machines. And this is a very simplified and sketchy summary of that. So I'm sure you all know how large language models work. And so I won't go in details here, but just to recall a couple of things that might be useful for understanding also the experiments that we ran. So I'm speaking about generative AI, okay, so ChatGPT and all these AI machines. As Anna said in the introduction, ChatGPT became basically popular at the end of 2022. So everybody was trying to use ChatGPT and try to chat with ChatGPT. And what surprised everybody at the very beginning was the fact that these tools are able to talk, to chat, to generate language. And so are based on models that are exactly called large language models, and that are able to generate this language, or to be more precise, to simulate humans' language by relying on a statistical process. So basically the words that ChatGPT and all these chatbots generate are put together relying on a huge amount of data, and starting from the observed probability that these words have been observed to be together in all the data that chatbots can rely on. So if the observed probability of having two words together is high, then there is a high probability that these words are put together by the AI machine when generating language. So this seems to be quite far from what we think about creativity, because we typically associate creativity to some spontaneous process, something unpredictable. On the other hand, if you go and read the instruction of ChatGPT, but I'm sure of also the other AI machines, you can try to understand how they work in terms of parameter. And there is a key parameter, which is called temperature, that regulates the randomness of these associations. So you can somehow manipulate how you put together these words, having words that are associated in order to be closer to what is typically observed, or you can push the degree of originality by raising this parameter, which is called temperature. So even if it looks like a probabilistic statistical process that is not spontaneous or creative, on the other hand, there is a way to push the level of originality, of creativity of the creative output generated by AI machine. So which is the context that comprise the experiments we ran about creativity and AI. So I will rely on this study we presented in this paper, which is a paper published in 2019, which is about creativity and incentives. So here the idea is totally unrelated to AI. It was not on our mind in that moment. But as economists, we had just a very, very simple question. Is it effective if we pay people to be more creative? So the typical question about incentives in economic, wondering whether paying people, giving monetary incentives may help in increasing some kind of performance. And in this case, it was a creative performance. It is also an experimental paper, and this is the paper where we introduce the distinction between closed and open tasks that Anna was mentioning. So as Rosa before, we started from a definition, of course. So we browsed all the psychology literature, and in the end, we came up with this definition based on Michael Mumford's studies that say that creativity is the ability of combining existing items, generating some novel content that needs to be recognized as useful, as new by peers. So we have two key ingredients in this definition. First of all is the combination thing, so putting together items that are already there. And the second ingredient is having this novelty and usefulness to be recognized by others, so the peer recognition. I'm stressing this out because this is crucial to understand why we did introduce the two types of tasks I will be describing. So first of all, defining what was creativity, at least for us. Of course, this is just a starting point. I'm not saying that this is the definition of creativity, but we needed a point to start. And second step, introducing one or more, and we ended up with two tasks to measure creativity. As I said, we ran experiments. So basically what we do in experiments, quite similarly to what psychologists do, there are also some methodological differences, but I don't have time to go into this. Of course, if you are interested, I can explain a bit more about that. But the idea is that we have experimental subjects, and in standard experiments, we typically use students just because they are easy to involve in. We work in university, but it's not always true. It depends on the research question. I have other papers on, for instance, attitude towards migrants, on reaction to be segregated, that of course are not the right questions to answer using students because they have never been segregated and because they typically are more open-minded than the general population, since they are young, well-educated, and so on. So it's not always the case, but in this case, we decided to enroll students. And so basically you have your experimental subjects and give them a task to complete. So we had to decide a task to measure creativity. And again, browsing the literature, we became quite interested into the fact that this task may had more or less constraint or more or less well-defined goals. So imagine this as a continuum where you have a task like, for instance, an equation, an algorithm, which is not, of course, a creative task, but just to give you an idea of an extreme, where you follow the rules, provided that you know them, but if you follow the rule in a case of an equation, you get to the solution. Of course, you have the constraints because you cannot go on as you like. You have a specific rule to solve it. So this is, for us, a fully closed task. So very well-specified constraints, a fixed solution. The goal is clear ex ante. On the other extreme, you may have a task when you know nothing. So you just do whatever you want. You don't have a constraint, but it's also not clear what you have to do and which is the solution to reach. So in principle, you have an infinite set of solutions. In the middle, we may have more or less closed tasks, more or less open as you like. And so we consider exactly this difference, and we went to decide for two tasks. I'm showing you that. Of course, we couldn't choose a fully closed task because it has nothing to do with creativity. And on the other hand, a fully open task didn't make any sense in terms of what we were doing. We were in the middle, and what matters for us is that one task is more closed than the other. Here, to simplify, we just have closed and open, but again, it's just in comparative terms. So for the closed task, we asked our subjects to write a creative story, and they had constraint. This was exactly the reason why we call it closed, which were represented by these 10 words: house, zero, forgive, and so on. So they had to be creative, but having the constraint of using compulsorily these 10 words, and of course any other word they wanted to. The open task was just inventing something by thinking of it. So no constraint, and just be as creative as they could. So these are the two tasks. Actually, in that paper, we had more tasks, but I focus on that because these are the same that we use also in the paper about creativity and AI. So what we found in this paper about incentives was that paying people was effective, but only in closed tasks. So paying people for inventing something with no constraints and no, let's say, rules, if you like, was not effective, while it was in the case of the closed task. And our interpretation was that this was the case because the closed task required more effort on the side of our subjects, because they had to stay into the constraint of using the 10 words. And the consequence was that the payment, the incentives were effective in exerting more effort. But I think that this was not exactly the whole story. We were not able to understand it in this paper. But going on with the research and involving AI helped us to understand and understanding a bit more. So exactly what we were saying before in the discussion. Probably it's also the tool, in this case, the AI tool, that helped us understand more about the way we are creative and what is needed to be creative. So I'm moving into the discussion of this second paper, which is exactly called Creativity and AI. It is forthcoming on the Economic Journal, and it's already on the website in open access. So if you want to, you're interested in reading it, it's available. And of course, I will be happy to share these slides if anyone is interested. So feel free to write me. Okay, so what we do in this other paper. So we have, again, an experiment. The design is a 2x2 design. It means that we manipulate two aspects. And so from the combination of these two aspects, we have 4 conditions, if you like. So again, we have the 2 types of tasks, closed and open, as before. And also we vary the fact that the creative agent might be a human, so an experimental subject as before, they were again students, or an AI machine. And we selected ChatGPT just because it was the most popular when we started. But of course, I'm aware of other studies replicating this or similar studies using also other AI chatbots. So basically, we had 40 human answers for the open task, other 40 for the closed task, and then we generated exactly the same amount of answers, creative answers, using ChatGPT. What we did was varying the temperature. Remember that I mentioned before the temperature as a key parameter that is indicated by ChatGPT developers as a way to increase the randomness in the association between words. So we vary the temperature along the possible spectrum of values from 0, which means no randomness, to 2, which is the maximum level. So the higher randomness you can, the highest, randomness you can obtain. And also we repeated the experiment 3 times using 3 versions of ChatGPT. So first we had in July 23, which was 3.5, then repeated in 2024 with GPT 4.0, and then GPT 4.5 in April 2025. So just the same experiment repeated 3 times, and you will see in the results that we have actually the results of 3 sessions, just to have an idea about the possible improvements in the development of ChatGPT. In total, we had 160 answers produced either by humans or by AI. And we asked some external people to assign a score to them. So we recruited them on a platform which is called Prolific. This is a platform where people can subscribe and be paid for completing tasks online, basically. And so it's often used by experimental economists to have evaluation, but also to be engaged in other kind of experiments, provided that they are administered online, of course. So we hired more than 700 of prolific subjects, let's call them judges, to distinguish from the experimental subjects. They received 6 creative answers to grade in a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 is the maximum level of creativity. They were, of course, blind to treatment, so they were not aware of what we were doing. We just said them assign a score this way. And in the very first session, the one with the GPT 3.5, they were also asked to motivate their score, just writing some free text to explain how they came to the score they gave. This also holds only for session 1, because for the other 2 sessions, 2 and 3, we decided to rely on the answers in session 1. We run what is called a topic modeling. So we try to understand which were the main consideration, the main topics that came out while these people were formulating their evaluations, and to give them more precise sub-items to evaluate. So I will explain this a bit more in depth when showing the results, but basically they were also asked to assign a score between 1 to 10 and to assess how original, well elaborated and nonsensical were the answer. So a general score about creativity, and then a specific score to each of these 3 items that emerged from the text analysis we ran about their motivation in session 1. Okay, so before showing you the results, I want to spend a few words on what happened with the ChatGPT 3.5, so the very first version of ChatGPT we used in our first session when modifying the temperature. So here I'm giving you 2 examples of answers in the open task. I'm showing you the open task because the difference is more apparent, but it was basically the same also in the closed task. So this is the task where they have to invent something. And as you can see, there is no big difference between having temperature equal to 0, which is the first answer. So no randomness, the less likely type of association between words, and temperature set at the default value, so equal to 1. In both cases, ChatGPT invents some kind of clean some device that generates clean energy or clean water. This was a typical answer when we ran the experiment. And remember that as any other chat box, ChatGPT is not neutral, so it's grounded on, it takes information on what it found on the web and on the content that circulates. So probably this was a big concern, all this pollution stuff in that moment. And this is reflected on the answers that, the creative answers that ChatGPT generated in that moment. But look at what happens when temperature was raised up to 2, so the maximum level. you can see that the invention is a bit more interesting, is this nano-equipped toilets, whatever they are. But what is interesting is that very soon the sentences are composed by almost random words that do not make any sense. So a problem that ChatGPT had in its very first versions up to 3.5 was the one of that was called hallucination. So many forms of hallucination, but also the fact of generating nonsense content. So in this version, there was this issue that pulling originality by increasing temperature had the consequences also of increasing randomness and so increasing nonsense. So the two things went together. This problem was basically solved already with ChatGPT 4.0. And this is true also for 4.5, so the other, let's say, subsequent version of ChatGPT that we use, because you can see that there is no more nonsensical sequence of words, even if the temperature here is 2. So what's happening here is that the invention that became more popular with this second version of ChatGPT was all this personal health assistance, so much reference to health, psychological issues and so on, but at least no, let's say, nonsensical sequence. In any case, let's look at the results. So this set of histograms is showing you the creative scores. Remember that we're between 1 to 10. 10 is the maximum. So we had in red AI, in blue humans, and the bars with the dots refer to the open task and the plain bars to the closed task. So you can see that the pattern across session is more or less the same because we see that AI is performing much better in the closed task. This is true for all the sessions. The opposite holds for open tasks. What happens is that humans are performing better, but so this seems a good news, but there is also a bad news. This difference is shrinking over time, so over session. You can see that in session 3, so the latest we ran, the difference is not so big. It is still significant, so we can say that humans are still outperforming humans, but AI, but the difference is reducing over time. So we try to understand a bit more what was happening, what was explaining and these results. So I skip this because I don't have time. So as I said before, in the first session, we had judges motivating their scores with open text, and the main issues that came out were that the grade, the score they gave was not so high because the answer was not original enough, or on the other hand, it was high because it was well elaborated. And sometimes the fact of having a nonsensical content came out, and this was specific to ChatGPT 3.5. So we use these 3 topics to inform our experiments and to ask to have a very specific grade also about these 3 aspects of creativity. And this is what we got. So in particular, I'm interested in showing you what happens with originality. So originality seems to be a prerogative of human beings because it stays higher for humans in the open task, as you can see here, even if we move from session 2 to session 3. This is not true for a closed task, probably because the fact of having this constraint, the fact of using words somehow cause human beings to focus on the fact of using the word, to staying into the constraints. And so this causes more effort in that direction than in the direction of being more original. But originality seems to be the competitive advantage of humans. In terms of elaboration, AI is much better, but somehow we expected that. And the nonsense seems to have been solved in terms of hallucination by ChatGPT, because it performs much better in not having nonsense, not creating nonsense answer with respect to humans. In the paper, we have a structural model. A structural model is a model that tries to go deeper into the structure of what we are not able to observe. And in the model, we try to measure, before measuring, we try to understand what drives this capability of being more original, especially in the open task. And so it's there that we introduce and we stress out the importance of imagination. So imagination is something that only human beings have with respect to animals, for instance, and also with respect to AI, because we are the only creature that are able to reason in terms of saying, what if? Okay, so to imagine possible worlds that we don't observe. AI works differently. It grounds on the information that are already there. It combines them very well. We have seen that elaboration is very good when made by AI, and it has been improving across session. But what characterized the human contribution, the human advantage, is exactly being imaginative and being able to come out with things that are not already there. And using this model, we are able to quantify the importance of imagination, which is I know that this number don't mean anything if you don't have the model, but I don't want to, being boring, showing you the equation, but somehow we quantify it between 35 and 22%, not because the importance of imagination is decreasing over time, but just because when evaluating the creative answers, judges might be more distracted by having a well-elaborated answer than in the general score. They put more weight on that instead of evaluating originality. But once you ask them explicitly to evaluate originality, as we did in session 2 and 3, then it came out that originality was the key aspects that AI machines are not able to replicate. So comparing the different version of ChatGPT, what we observe is that AI is improving in generating well-elaborated answers that can simulate language better and better. Also, they seems to have solved the hallucination issues, so their answers are not no more nonsensical as they were at the very beginning when raising temperature, but originality stays as a key ingredient of human intelligence. They are not able to replicate originality because it's something that is not possible to replicate, at least now that we are speaking. I don't know how much time I have.
You have, I think, 10. There's a Q&A still following. It's 10:20. We have 10 minutes left for the end of your session. So if you could wrap it up now.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay, so just something that is really intriguing for me, because I started having some discussion about the role of imagination with some colleagues working on evolutionary biology, because in my university we are 30 departments, so we can rely on many different competencies. And so they told me, we started discussing about the fact that imagination seems to derive, in order, at least for the knowledge that we have so far, in the fact that we are animals that are characterized by what is called the neoteny. So the fact that we keep childhood features also when we grow up, until at least 20 years, or when we are 20 years old, so not my case anymore, unfortunately. But the idea is that since our brain goes on developing for a long time after our birth, our synapses develop having all the stimuli coming from the external world, and this is what makes us so able to be imaginative, and this is why we have this feature, imagination, that is not that cannot be found anywhere else. And so I just want to mention this because it was extremely interesting when I learned it. So I think we can go to the conclusions. So what I've presented you very quickly, and sorry if I've been not so clear in some aspects, but it was due to time constraints, are the results of a set of experiments we ran in order to having AI competing somehow with humans in being engaged in producing creative answers depending on the specific type of task. We had two more or less open. So what we found is that AI is doing very well, but for what concerns what we call open tasks, so the ones when we basically require more originality, more creativity, humans are still better, and this advantage seems not to be reducing over time. AI are very good in elaborating answers, are improving in not generating hallucinations, but for what concerns originality, we are still outperforming them, and this seems to be due to a characteristic that we have, a feature that we have, which is imagination. So, of course, the let's say natural conclusion of what we can learn from these results is that more than being afraid of being substituted by AI machines, we should probably enjoy the fact that we can rely on a tool that can help us with boring stuff, with routine tasks, with endeavors that are more standardized, and use all our efforts to focus on what needs our imagination. So this is what I have for today, and thank you very much for having me again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grieco, for that wonderful presentation. We can open it up to questions now. So you can put questions in the chat window, or raise your hand if you want to ask it yourself. I'll give the first, we just have 5 minutes for this, so I'll let our moderator, panel moderator, Kimberly, have the first go while people put in the questions. Kimberly?
Yeah, so one question that I had was, with the closed tasks, what were the topics that they focused on?
Okay, good question. So since there were some words like planets, for instance, or ring. There were many of their answers that was about Saturn or the planet with the ring and so on. So there were recurring patterns, I mean, some similarities across the answer. In the very first paper, the one about incentives, we also hired judges that made a specific study on that in order to see how, let's say, the topic of that were more frequent, deriving from the specific combination of words, and then assign a score based on how far they were in terms of this kind of stories. So, of course, it is a very good point, because it depends on the specific words you give them, because there were some that were more difficult to put together. There were also cows, so some other people were focusing on this cow called Zero, because zero was another word we had. But yeah, it was fun to read these answers, and there were, I can say, 3-4 more recurrent topic, and then, of course, some people who invented something completely new, and so they were evaluated as more creative also on this basis.
Yeah, because I teach both computer science related courses and philosophy related courses. And from the attempts of my students to cheat using LLMs, it's much better at things that showed up a lot in 90s, 2000s, 2010s blog posts. So things, that's why it's so good at programming, right? So many programmers put out information and all that's in the training data. Not so many philosophers. So I was just wondering if there were a way to manipulate the perceived topic of the closed tasks to things that LLMs are less good at, if you would see the same distinction between the closed and the open. But I don't know if that would be a really hard way to try to create it.
It's a great idea, actually. Yeah.
Well, it's so bad at philosophy. It'll recite facts, and it's like, well, but that's what somebody reading a magazine article would get by reading this technical philosophy.
Yeah, that's why I was saying that basically it simulates language, but it seems to be improving in making us, let's say, thinking that this is human language, but actually it's a machine. It doesn't know anything. It's just replicating and being closer to what we may expect to read. So this is exactly the point. It's improving in simulating, but not in knowing stuff. So yeah, everywhere there is something to reason about, it is very bad, because if you know, you catch it. And so if students use them without, let's say, readjusting, you catch them. At least I do for what I do in my classes and so on.
Oh, there's a question in the chat. So your future research resonates strongly with the creative process of both and thinking within an applied creative process. I agree that there's much room for the synergy between human insight and evidence as an embodied process. And one can't do without the other. They're already there in many cases. That's a nice comment. All right.
Sorry, I didn't, I wasn't able to hear you because I'm not hearing you very well. So what is the question?
Sorry, it's mostly a nice comment. That your future research resonates strongly with the creative process of both and thinking within an applied creative process.
Both.
Yeah. I'd like to have your consideration on one question. I'm fascinated by what you saw in relation to nonsense and elaboration. I mean, elaboration, I just think, well, we'll elaborate less. We have energy demands on us, right? As human beings, but we're going to do the minimum required in 2 minutes. Whereas for an LLM, there's no real energy it feels as a system. Whereas the nonsense thing is interesting to me, because in the first version of ChatGPT, that humans come out as nonsensical is kind of nonsensical is fascinating to me, because I imagine we're generating a different kind of nonsense, right? So because if you look at for ChatGPT's nonsense is often like, this makes it is really nonsense. It just doesn't make any sense. Whereas humans can be judged as being nonsensical because they just wrote something weird. Just that's
weird or
off the
not
beaten track. So there's something in the way in which we assess for this that, might be using the same word, but they're really quite different things, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're totally right. In fact, we had no cases where humans just put a random sequence of words because we don't do that exactly. Yeah. But somehow nonsense was also associated by evaluators to the fact that the creative story with the cow, the zero, and so on didn't make any sense because, of course, it was not so easy to combine. So that's why nonsensical answers were more frequent for humans in the closed task because that was the effort of taking all this stuff together. Whereas they were more frequent in case of ChatGPT with the open task because there was no constraint and ChatGPT is used to follow the instructions. So if you don't give instructions, it's a bit complicated for it to work properly. It works better if you give very specific instructions. But again, there was an improvement over sessions. So we didn't observe this sequence of words. Probably it was a kind of issue with the very first version and the way they set parameters also.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Daniela. Please continue to ask questions and we'll take them all up in the panel discussion. I want to invite our third and final speaker for session one. Let me get him here. Yes, Francesco Fedele here, who is here to speak about his unique approach as well. I'll just give a little introduction before I let him get started. So Professor Fedele is an associate professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Georgia Tech here in the United States. His interdisciplinary research focuses on ocean engineering, arts, and creativity. Now, he began practicing art in earnest in 2016 during a 2-year recovery from an injury as a form of self-learned art therapy. And he mentions how his transformative experience gave him a new outlet of self-expression that he continues to pursue. He's worked with many artists and infuses arts into curriculum at Georgia Tech for a more holistic experience in the classroom. He's developed several innovative courses on art and geometry and art and generative AI at Georgia Tech. And his approach is featured in an online magazine, The US Conversation, on this series on uncommon courses, which highlights unconventional approaches to teaching. I'll put in the link in the chat window in a second. His talk title is Art Meets AI, Community-Based Teaching and Learning. Thank you so much, Francesco.
Thank you, Anna. So I have a problem sharing the screen. Can you see my screen? Can you see the screen?
No, we can only see you.
I
thought I saw something in a second ago. Now we can. Yeah, now we can see your screen. Perfect.
Okay. Oh my God, I don't know what is going on. Why is doing that?
It's rushing through it.
Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yeah, I can see David Leffel. You don't want to pay. And now it's running through it again.
Yeah, I'm doing it myself, so I'll go back.
Okay, good. Okay, good.
Okay.
Perfect.
So, one moment. Where is that? No. Sorry, one moment. Okay. I think it's fine. So, oh my gosh, why all the time?
Is this the first time it's happened?
Oh my gosh, again.
Okay. Maybe to share just
Can you see it now?
Yes.
So since 2018, I've been trying to infuse and integrate art in STEM classrooms here at Georgia Tech, and more recently also including AI. And my goal, is to try to synergize teaching fundamental of arts, all different type of media, from drawing to painting, dance and sculpting, geometry, especially relating to Einstein relativity, concept from neuroscience, and more recently, all topics related to AI and machine learning. And oh my gosh, why is important for me, is important to teach engineering student art and to make them to practice art. I want to give you some example from history. So you all know Leonardo da Vinci. Here we are 1500, and this is one of his drawings on the left of a water fountain. Besides an artist, Leonardo was also a scientist, and he was obsessed with water. He even wrote a book about water. And besides the artistic quality of this picture, you can clearly see the amazing skills of Leonardo, that he was able to observe nature and capture the fundamental elements of what he was observing. In this case here, we see a water fountain, and what he represented here, these large squares of vortices, and then on top of it, you all have all these tiny vortices. And actually, this is not, besides the artistic depiction of water, this is actually a true observation of how water turbulence behave. And later on, in the 1800, physicist Reynolds come up with the Reynolds decomposition in fluid mechanics, that basically decompose a turbulence into a large scale flow of vortices plus tiny vortices, a soup of vortices. We can think of turbulence. And then what is nice that Leonardo was using this concept of a vertical water vortex, fluid vortex, to depict the air of in his preparatory drawing of his Madonna paintings. And you can see here that Leonardo was okay. It's gonna be a nightmare. So another example is from Sandro Botticelli, still the same period. So these are very rare drawings. What is going on?
Do you want to maybe not put it on full screen and just go? That might be easier. Yeah, like that. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So and so, with Botticelli, he made some rare drawings of the Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri. And here, you see some of his drawing illustrating, some of the components about the paradise part of the Divine Comedy. And so here you have this interpretation of constellation and universe and stars, and again here we have an artist that is observing the sky and then imagining how it would be basically the universe and constellations. And the other more clear examples, it comes from Van Gogh, 1850. So Van Gogh had an amazing skills of really be able to see through things and be able to put on canvas whatever was observing. And this is the famous painting you all know, is the Starry Night at the MoMA Museum, that he created when he was in an asylum during one of his many mentally unstable periods with psychotic behavior and hallucination. Even this is after he cut his own hair. And you can see here that he depicted basically the turbulent motion that he was observing through his window of the sky and atmosphere. And actually, scientists have analyzed this drawing, and they found out that these vortices, they are the vortices that Van Gogh depicted in his painting. So they have the same properties of realistic vortices. And so what happened that he made other painting similar to this Starry Night, but the vortices, the vertical motion that he depicted in the other paintings, did not capture the true properties of a realistic vortex. And so it's pretty interesting that, when he was in this mentally unstable state, that somehow, he had some superior capabilities, to be able to observe nature and be able to see the true essential element. So this is very fascinating. Of course, that's why I believe it's important to student to practice art and learn fundamentals of art and practicing art. But making art, my experience with students, for some students, is intimidating making art. Indeed, I mean, if you ask a student to draw, at the beginning, it's, oh, don't look at me, I can't draw. But actually, yes, you can, and you can find a lot of arguments, that modern teaching, is basically killing creativity. And here there is a very nice quote by Picasso: "Every child is an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once they grow up." You know very well that if there is a kid, and you see one of his drawing and you're gonna tell, oh, you don't know how to draw, oh, you don't know how to paint, oh, this is terrible. I mean, you're gonna kill that kids. I mean, in mentally, in the sense that he will basically enclose into himself, and it will take a while to basically be able to open up and free the mind again. But the argument that I make that we are born to create, is already in the caveman. The caveman did not even talk, and he was making graffiti. And if you think about it, even in nature, there are all these fantastic little pufferfish artists that they already have encoded in their DNA, to basically create these beautiful sand patterns, which again, they are all about for attracting the mate, so that they can reprocreate. And so actually, there is a very nice quote by one of my favorite Italian artists, Gino Di Dominicis: "Drawing, painting, and sculpture are not traditional forms of expression, but they are original forms of expression. And so they belong to the future." So basically, what he meant is basically that, as a humans, we are born to create. And there is a beautiful book by Hans Prinzhorn. He was a German psychiatrist that during the 1930s, he also had an art degree, and he was interested in art. And basically he wrote this book, The Artistry of the Mentally Ill, in which he wanted to just analyze the drawing and painting of his mentally ill patients, just from an artistic point of view. And this argument, I mean, as a human, we have a lot of urges, but there is also there are also primordial urges to create. And, this is from the book. There is the urge to play, to basically move around, dance, and follow rhythms. The ornamental urge. So basically, we want to make our room, our house, our environment rich. Why? Because basically, we want to attract our mate and reprocreate. The urge for ordering tendencies, rhythms and rule and patterns, music, dance, and visual effect. The coping of urge. So the tendency to imitate, think about the forgers, famous forger in history, and many, many others. So, there is the big why, because basically, we are social elements, social animals. We want to belong. And that's why, this is already encoded in our little brain. And of course, then there is the need for symbolism, so to give significance to objects, though this relate to religion and more. And so, that in Milwaukee, there is the Milwaukee Art Museum. There is an entire section dedicated to what is called the outsider art, which is basically, the art created by mentally ill people. Don't confuse outsider art with degenerate art that was defined by Hitler, to distinguish from the good art and the bad art of the 1900 made by Picasso, Matisse, and many, many other German artists. So he made a degenerate art exhibit in Berlin, during the 1940s to basically, ostracize and ridiculize the bad art of the modern art of that time, but actually was a great success, and so he had the negative effect. But going back to these drawings made by mentally ill people, many of them, they don't have they don't have any art training, but it's pretty amazing. No matter how the brain is damaged, you still have this urge to create. And if you look at this portrait, I found it extremely expressive. And of course, it clearly denotes, sadness of the person that is, made the drawing, but extremely expressive. So of course, because they are mentally ill, maybe they don't care that they don't know how they never drew before, and so they just do it because it is basically encoded in our DNA. And then you can also see these other examples, but I want to show this other example here. If you're familiar with the Picasso painting, this is it's an amazing example of Picasso painting that maybe there was. And again here you see this other painting, the urge for rhythms and rules. So the sequence of patterns always recurrent, and then basically here this could be basically a portrait made by an engineer. And then here you see also this amazing painting, or even drawing. If you look at this drawing here, it is clear that the person that made this drawing was had some artistic training, and of course, they, when they do these drawings, we always draw from our memories. This called eidetic memories, and so I found this. It is clear that this person has been suffering, and so he has maybe some aspect of his childhood with his mother, and then they have all this bird, that are very hostile, and so basically, a very disturbing drawing, but extremely expressive. So, which and another more modern example is with the artist Yayoi Kusama. She did an exhibit here at Georgia Tech, here in Atlanta, the High Museum in 2015. And so, and she's basically, lives in a mental hospital. I don't know what she suffered, or some schizophrenia, or apparently, she was abused. She had a very, very hard childhood that may have triggered, this predisposition for mental illness. But, she's allowed to leave the hospital for 3-4 days, 3-4 hours per day, and she can make his own art. And you can clearly see here now all the Prinzhorn primordial urges, the rhythm and rules, ornamental, enriching your environment, they are all here. They are all here now, can be observed through in her art. And so basically, how can we, how can you teach engineering student art? So basically, I adopted this model, this teaching model, and so of a creative course that is co-taught by an engineering faculty, a STEM faculty, and a professional artist. And so, because I think it's important that students are exposed to different teaching styles, engineers, we teach very systematically. We teach methods, very, very rigid. And instead, artists, they teach by osmosis. They are an art teacher will never tell you how to draw and how to paint. You need to figure out yourself. She can show to you. The artist can show to you how she draw and paint, how to mix colors. But then basically, you have to figure it out yourself. So that you can come up with your own expression. And so I follow this model, and so since 2018 I created 2 courses, one on art and geometry taught by together with several artists, and then more recently one course on art and AI. And I'm going to first tell you a little bit about the art and geometry, and then later I will tell you more about art and AI. With art and geometry, basically here I put together Picasso and Einstein, which they were basically peers of their time, the beginning of the 1900s. And basically, modern science is Einstein and modern art is Picasso. And it's pretty amazing that both of them, they were inspired by the recent novel ideas of the time about exotic geometries, the dimension of the fourth dimension of time that was made by Poincaré. And both Picasso and Einstein, they were aware of this concept. And indeed, in 1905, Albert Einstein came up with his seminal paper on special relativity that completely changed the foundation of Newtonian physics and led to the more modern science of our time. And in 1907, Picasso has produced Le Mademoiselle d'Avignon, that you see here, the painting that basically had marked the beginning of modern art. And what happened is that with Picasso and Einstein, space and time are not anymore absolute, but become relative. For Picasso, space simultaneously, you can clearly see here in this portrait in which in the same image you will see the front face and the side view. And so basically, reality is not just from one fixed perspective like we knew from the Renaissance, until the 1800 art, where the artists, they had to depict realistic what they would observe from one point perspective. That's completely broken. So reality is another hand on the elephant. So it's a multiple perspective, and the same concept can also be related to Einstein. And so during this course, I also teach fundamentals of geometry. To try to. I think it's important that engineers they get familiar with this general relativity, which, if the GPS that you use every day on your phone works because of Einstein and his general relativity correction. And so, in order to infuse art, I decided to take a community-based learning approach. And so I got funding from the Georgia Tech Center for Teaching and Learning to basically teach art and AI courses, in collaboration with community artists of the Atlanta area. And the interaction has to be symbiotic, a two-way. So the artists, come to class and teach students how to make art, and then students they also gonna give back, by, for example, helping artists, learning more about AI or how to use AI to create to do art. And so basically, since 2018, the idea is I created an agile artist community where it allows for an agile horizontal integration of art in STEM courses. And the idea is that if you're teaching an engineering course and you would like to teach some art, so you just choose the module that you want: drawing, painting, sculpture, dance, whatever. And then basically there will be an artist that will come to your course, and it can be a one-time event, it can be a weekly meetings, bi-weekly meeting. And by doing this way, this allows for there will be no extra work on STEM faculties, and is also a low budget. So, and over the years, I've been collaborating with several artists from the Atlanta area, and so which here I give you some example. Saber Essler, no, she's basically a multimedia artist. Rachel Grant, she's a visual artist with experience, in plein air painting. Then I also work with Adam Faust from the Cullenwood Fine Arts Center here in Atlanta. He's basically a collage artist. I also work with dance companies, so I also want a student to experience dance and movement. And another artist, Mark Liebert, is an expert in art and technology. And then Jerusha Graham and Adol, they are actually educational curators and coordinators of the Paper Museum at Georgia Tech. And they've been helping me also teaching the class. So when I am in the classroom, I follow two principles. This is one of my colleague and friend from physics, Petra Xitanovic. The brain cannot process faster than the hand. So basically, the idea that I reason together with students, I derive everything with students. So I don't come to class with a 100 slide PowerPoint presentation and dump on students one book, an entire book of concept, and then so I don't do that. And so I prefer students to work together on a few fundamental concepts and topics, and I want to make sure that they really understand them fully and process them in time. And another beautiful quote that was very inspiring for me is from one of my favorite American artists, one of the greatest portrait artists, American artists of our times, David LaFell. This is one of his portraits, and so you can see that he's inspired by Rembrandt style. So you don't learn to paint, you paint to learn. That's what I found very inspiring. To learn what? To learn how to see. We go back to Leonardo and Van Gogh. We go back to Leonardo and Van Gogh. And so you need to learn how to see the essential element of the subject that you want to study and represent in your painting. And this is exactly what an engineer or a scientist has to do. So he has a problem, so he has to understand what are the essential elements of the physical phenomenon that he's dealing with, and then be able to come up with a mathematical model, a physical solution, and so on. So this is a very inspiring quote. And so in the classroom, together with the artist, and so we practice a lot this learn how to see, drawing, especially drawing from life. And so here we do still lifes, a still life or plein air painting. Of course, with the help of artists, we teach fundamentals of drawing, painting, and design. We also do critique sessions, which are very important, so students kind of learn from each other. And then we do end of year art exhibits where we show the artwork that the student made during the year. Of course, I also teach fundamentals of AI, and how to use it to create art. And so, I start with the linear perceptron from 1943, which is basically, the building block of modern neural network, and then go to the more, the Hopfield network and the Hinton-Boltzmann machine in 1980, which are, Hopfield and Hinton, they got the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2024 for their groundbreaking work on AI because of the Boltzmann machine and the Hopfield network. And then we go to the more modern transformers in 2017, which are basically, the core engine of large language models like ChatGPT. And here I'm going to show you, this is a brief video, during the, this is during the art labs. So you have artist Saber Essler that basically, she's helping students, to learn how to see and be able to depict in drawing, this toy still life. And so, the student, this part is always very interesting. So I push a lot for, of course, I also teach fundamentals of AI, and so you see everything by hand. So, and also we also make students to experience dance and movement workshops, so that they can learn more about the body motions, their body and embodiment and so on. So this is details of the toy still life, and again, and then of course, I mean, I focus a lot on oil painting, which is one of my favorite medium. So here you have Saber Esler, that again, she's painting from life, from trying to paint. And then again, I mean, you see here, I go back here and also show you, how I teach the fundamental part. Here, basically, here, student, we are at the Got Farm. Student learn how to mix colors, which for me is very hard because I am colorblind on the red-green color blindness. And so, it's been very hard for me. It took me a while for me to figure out how to come up with some decent mixing of colors, which of course, I mean, I don't even know if I mix them well because I'm colorblind, so, but it's okay. And so we also do collage workshop here, which actually the students love it. So these are extremely freedom of expression. And then basically, some plein air painting, with Rachel Grant here, the artist that, has been working with me for several years. And so yeah, let me show you some, so, AI can learn and generate, but students can also learn and create because they are being in the world. AI is not. And so, in order to be creative, so it's important, to feel the world around you. So the interaction with people, the emotions and feeling. And so that's also very important, for a true creativity, be very effective. And that's what really AI is missing, So if you think about a baby, during his first 6 months of life, through his auditory, sensory, and through his vision, he basically acquired the same amount of data that has been used to train the original model of ChatGPT. Think about it. Just the first 6 months of his life, they basically represent the entire data set that has been used to train ChatGPT. So that's clearly show a limitation. So these are beautiful. We make students to draw their shoes. So here you see some beautiful, so we make them to do self-portraits. Some of them are done from a mirror, some of them are done from pictures. And so many of the students never practiced art before. And so the artists, they were really good in pulling out their artistic, their art out of them. So I'm going to show you some self-portraiture, which I found it very fascinating because it really reflects how students here they feel completely comfortable in the classroom to express themselves. And, and each of these drawings, they reflect their own persona, their own expression. And so, and they're very fascinating. So, and I also enjoy, seeing basically the process of creating this portrait. And many of the students, they never draw before. I mean, this artist, the student, she already had some other artistic training, but it really doesn't matter because all of them, they are very unique and expressive, and that's what counts to me when it comes to art. So, as long as you are expressive and you express yourself, you're going to be unique and original. And of course, we also make students to work together and create AI dance performances. Unfortunately, you cannot hear the audio, but this is a dance performance I create together with students last year. It's about the missing algorithm, and the music that you cannot hear is generated by the brainwaves of the dancers. And the visual that you observe here in the background, they are generated with AI. And, and again, here is about, the interaction between human and AI. And it was an interesting, it was my first performance in public. So we did it at one of the art event last year in Atlanta. And so it was very successful. And these are students. So there is a student, faculty, and a professional dancer. So the lady in blue is a faculty, and and the other two are, one is operational dancer and the other is a student. So, and then on the background, there are other students that design all the AI system and the music and so on. So now, I also did, for the first time, I did some testing, to try to measure if teaching art and AI can enhance the creativity in engineering students. And so, again, creativity is still very hard to come up with a unique definition. But I got help. I got help. I got help from. I got help from. I got help from some psychologists and educational psychologists, Amanda Nolan and Kate Williams. And they helped me to design a few tests. We did the Pardue spatial visualization test and the Kaufman test and a qualitative survey. So the Pardue test, it basically is an objective assessment of the capability of the ability of students to mentally rotate 3D objects in their mind. And I gave you just the main results that we found. The pool of students was around 40 students, for teaching two courses. And so we found that female students with a low Pardue pre-scores, so basically, at the beginning of the course, improve their post scores more significantly than male students. And of course, because the maximum score that you can get in this test is 30, we observe what is called in educational psychology the ceiling effect, which in engineering we will call it linear saturation. Basically, test scores cluster near the maximum possible score. And so basically, sometimes it was very hard to test the ability to discriminate among high-performing students. And then we made the student to do at the beginning, at the end of the course, the Kaufman Domain of Creativity Scale test, which basically is a subject assessment, a self-reported introspection to assess the creativity in these 5 fields: scholarly, self-everyday, artistic, mechanical, performance. And again, here we also collected data. And what is interesting here that we found that male students with a low pre-scores improve their post-scores more significantly than female students, except for the dimensions of performance and artistics. Just to remind you that the Pardue test is an objective test. The Kaufman is subjective. And then we also did the qualitative survey. And so here there are some comments which I found it interesting. So this class from students, this class was embodiment of connectivity and safety. I'm close with all the other students and we have relationships because of this space. So what happened basically, teaching art with an artist create basically, a safe environment during the art lab. And so it really helps students to build community and become more social and build relationships. And then of course, this also the course has been beneficial for students. I try so many new things that I never thought I would be able to do. In terms of AI, I never thought I would be able to make sense of the algorithm code, but with the professor help, I was able to understand and produce my own AI output. In terms of art, I never thought I would be able to create a portrait, but because of the artist, coming to teach us, I felt more confident in my ability, and I was able to execute painting. And and again here I made the student to write their own codes to do the AI algorithms. I didn't make them to use the available softwares, like ChatGPT or other. So they all did their AI they chose their own data, collected the data, wrote the algorithm, and then implemented. And here now, to end my presentation, so I tried to use some machine learning algorithms, to try to classify the content of this qualitative survey and come up with dendrograms, so a tree to see what are the most important words and concepts that come up from the qualitative survey. So, and I mean, they reflect basically the student survey comment. And I think I'm done. So let's see if I am in time. Ooh, 11.
Yes, you are. You're
Okay.
fine. Don't worry. Okay.
Thank
you
you.
so much, Professor Fedele. We have 5 minutes for questions for him. Could you stop sharing, Francesco, for a second? And then I will let Kimberly start with a question, and then it'll switch right into the panel discussion. So first 5 minutes for questions for Professor Fedele alone.
Great. I'm just so excited about this. I have a couple, but I'll start with one. So I taught for a number of years at Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York State. And my experience of engineering students is that they're really great when things are black and white. So I teach philosophy. They struggled with the ambiguity in philosophy. I'm wondering, is this an elective courses or these required courses? And how much resistance do you get just because my experience was they love math, they know when it's right or that's wrong. When there's not a clear right answer, they got really, really uncomfortable at the very least. So I guess part of it is how are you getting them engaged, and
I want to be honest with you. My experience with Georgia Tech students, they are they want to do art. So, I mean, and many of them, they are already very creative and open-minded. So especially the one that decide to take this course, they are already, a little bit free-minded. And of course, also very good students, and so actually, I never experienced, the kind of, I want to say limitations, but more or less, I mean, they want to do art. So that's for sure. For them, is not only as an outlet, maybe, it's kind of, maybe they get bored with engineering, so they want to try something different and be more expressive. So I guess, modern students, somehow maybe the teaching style that we do now, it basically confine them, and it's too black and white that you were talking about. And so they feel constrained. And so, during the art lab, finally, they can finally express themselves and do whatever they want. So, and again, I mean, the sample of student is very small, so I cannot generalize, but, this is basically, my personal opinion from observing how students behave, during the class.
This is an elective for them?
Yeah, it can be an elective, but I also have an undergrad. The art and geometry is basically for grad student, and the art and AI is for undergrads. So basically, it can be an elective, yeah.
Oh, cool. The other question, and I'm not sure about this, just because I've seen some of Mark Riddell's work with the AI and dance, is your work connected to that, or are those just separate parallels?
Say it again.
Mark Riddell, who I believe is in the computer science, is also doing AI and art with the dance at Georgia Tech.
Mark Riddell.
Okay, so I think you are not connected. So these are just two different.
No, I'm not connected. No, he's I do art performances, but this is outside, and working together with artists. I've been doing for a while, since 2018. They are other Georgia Tech faculty that they are involved with AI. But I do brain music, brainwave music. So so we try to do something with Tana. You remember?
Yeah.
So it's there's a lot of going on. So we have a new program on art and technologies at Georgia Tech. So it's coming. Yeah.
There's There's a question in the chat window. Maybe we'll take this and then we'll go to the panel discussion, which is from Mirinda Coleman. Lots of appreciation coming through, by the way. And I think Mirinda said that maybe the problem with your slides going was because it's on autoplay, but just so that if it happens again, you can check on that. So her question is, how does brainwave music work?
Well, I mean, it's very easy. So no, we buy this Muse headset, $250 that we can basically acquire real time the 5 brain waves, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and their samples. We can sample them every half a second, a quarter of a second. And then we feed them into a music program that is free. It's called Music Collider. And with this Music Collider, we can basically code music. And so we use the signals of the brain waves, to modulate the frequency or pitch of notes. And then I had a student that is also a musician and played the piano, so he was able to also add harmony to this music. Otherwise, if you do just pure, otherwise, it sounds very primordial, which is also very interesting. Just rhythm, the rhythm of the mind. And more recently, we can also feed it into AI systems, and basically, convert brain waves into text, images, and so on. So, now, I mean, these things are pretty obvious nowadays. But of course, yeah. But it was interesting, that the interaction with the dancers, that they were able to then interpret this music. Sometimes we had the dancers wearing the headset, and so they would hear the music generated by themselves, So they would dance on their own music generated by their own brain waves. And so there would also be, okay, the platform is called Super Collider. The platform is called the AI platform, which the best in terms of, actually, I didn't use any AI platform in the sense, I taught the student fundamentals of AI. So we just use the simple, basic AI algorithms like the Boltzmann machine, the Hopfield network. And I taught the students, to basically push the AI system to a state of weakness in which it can hallucinate so that, it can create, and then, the student would come in, take this hallucinated output and recreate some new one. So that was basically the human AI interaction. But basically, we didn't use any built, black box system that you see. So the student wrote their own coding from scratch. And nowadays, even with Claude, Anthropic Claude, it can also help students with coding. So the student, it's much easier now. You can even code. I think it's important that students appreciate all the steps that are behind designing an AI algorithm, because at least, the data, they were their own data. The student had control on the data. When you use ChatGPT, you have no clue on what data the system was trained on. And so, it could and you don't even know the training if it has been biased towards a certain subset of the data compared to others. So, that's another big issue. That's it. But now that, my interpretation, the interpretation of Plato, the Plato vision of art, of science, that there is no discoveries. Everything is already somewhere there in some place, and just the scientists, we just have to go and find it, So there is no new discoveries. Everything is already there. It's just that we don't know what it is. So I think, AI to me is kind of Platonic. It is basically an amazing tool that will help us to explore the Platonic landscape of all human-made data. That's how I see. So it is an interpretation. I mean, they are, I talk with philosophers, here at Georgia Tech, and they kind of agree, partially agree. And so I mean, it's
but
yeah. So
yeah.
which
Thank
then,
you for Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can see the three speakers and Dr. Kimberly Van Orman, who's joining us here as a moderator. Just to introduce Kimberly as well. She's a lecturer and undergraduate coordinator at UGA's Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and she's a philosopher by training, and her work bridges the gap between the humanities and the technical sciences, when the particular focus that she brings is on philosophy of mind, cognition, and AI ethics. Which I think is a wonderful one to bring here. First of all, thank you to all the speakers. Francesco, great presentation. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. And we'd like to open it up for question and answers. Now, me and Kimberly will ask questions till the sun comes down. Thankfully the speakers are just like, no, you just have us here for 45 minutes more and that's it. But so please take this opportunity to ask them questions, comments, and so on. Use the chat window for this. And I know that there are some people coming in from the Hoover platform who put in questions. I'm sorry, we can't see them here. But Desi has been monitoring this, and she's going to point out there's been 3 questions for the speakers there. So could you call them out loud, Desi?
Yes, my pleasure. So the first question was for Rusa, which is, what is the greatest challenge when the creative workers used their creativity to work or collaborate with AI, and how did they solve it? So the challenges that your folks faced using AI.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks also to the other speakers, Daniela and Francesco. It was really interesting. Yeah, the greatest challenge. So just to recap, since I had the first presentation, if you forget what I was doing, so I interviewed artists and scientists, and who were using AI in some form. So often the challenge was very field related. So for the scientists, the challenge was, of course, if the model they were trying to do or they were using to do something to achieve some specific goal did not work, and they could not figure out why it doesn't work. So that was definitely the biggest challenge, and they often saw it as the biggest hurdle for their own creative work. But then again, once they had figured it out, like once they found the solution, they often felt that was one of the most creative moments of their work. So in the sense that tool was also participating in this problem solving by creating the problem that they could solve. So that was quite interesting. For the artists, I would say the greatest challenge was, I don't know, I guess they had challenges, but they didn't necessarily see them as much as these kind of challenges to their work, because then they just tried to work around it a bit more. Or at least I don't think they framed it as a challenge from the technology perspective. For them, the challenge was more coming from the outside, not getting funding or not finding that good platform to present their work or whatever. It wasn't often related to technology so much, or at least not the greatest challenge, as the question was. So yeah, different challenges related to the fields. So yeah, hopefully that was answering the question. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. And this next question is for Daniela. Does human AI co-creation operationalize creativity as a 2-stage process? Stochastic generation from AI and utility-driven selection, human. And how does this structure affect the resulting distribution of creative outputs compared to human-only or AI-only systems?
Okay, so thank you so much for the question. Actually, the second, let's say, strand of experiments we are planning on this topic is precisely on this. So for now, what I can say is that I don't know, because in experiments, you have to, say, go in the lab and see what happens. So the way we are planning to do that is having our subjects to be able to access AI while completing our tasks. And the manipulation we are thinking about is training them before or not. Because of course everybody seems to be able to use AI, but there is a lot to understand about prompts and so on. So at the moment, I don't know how will be the stages of the process. My anticipation is that the people might use AI to have I don't know, an initial phase of proposing ideas. But somehow I don't know if it's a good strategy, because typically, as we have seen, AI's ideas are not so original. So having some example may, let's say, cause humans' idea to, let's say, have a direction which is not so original. So this could be another angle to explore. My take, also from our initial experiments where there is no explicit complementarity, is that AI would be used to, let's say, complete all the routine part of the task, and then humans can dedicate on generate, let's say, original ideas. But for what is my experience, it's very difficult to predict what you find in experiments. So now I'm working with the University of Strasbourg, because there they have a very interesting experimental lab where you can follow subjects also using microphones, using cameras that follow them while interacting, and so the idea is having a clear idea of how the creative process goes on, because when you use standard experiments, you just have the creative output and that's it. And okay, you can collect data also, making people answering a questionnaire during the task or at the end. In this case, we will have a better observation of what is happening. And so we are also interested to understand exactly the phases. So once you have AI and you have to deal with the creative task, what you do, you start interrogating AI, or you start thinking by yourself, which prompts are you using, how these things change if you are trained to this kind of specific task, and so you are more somehow you are trained to do so, and so you think about things that were never that before never came to your mind. So this is the second phase of my research on that. So we are planning to run these experiments. Let's say from September on. So I hope to have an article soon on that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. And Francesco, this final question is for you from the Q&A, which is, were there any administrative challenges in building this course? Were there any group of people in particular who needed convincing of this approach to learning art/engineering?
Wow, is this from someone that I know?
Someone you should know, probably.
Yeah. You know what? I will skip this question. So I prefer not to answer. But it was not easy, and I'm still facing challenges. But I don't take it personal. I think, of course, if you have a school that is about technology, the way I want to teach art, is more like a fine art school. I really want a student to experience, like to be an art student, and do things with their hand, drawing, painting. And of course, here when you talk about art, they want to see art and technology. Because I mean, it's a technology school, but I think it's important before doing technology that student know how to draw, some students, they don't even know how to draw a circle by hand or even try to depict a concept using a pencil. And I think, that's why, it's very important to me. It's very important, but now, no, I've been having over the last few years, I've been having an increased support from the administration. So, but still there are challenges, the funding, but again, to be honest with you, I only need $3,000 per semester. That's what it is and I basically hire. I pay the artist $250, 250 per lab. So, and I can have 5, 6 artists teaching over the semester. So the students are exposed to diverse. So actually, it's a very low budget. But it's coming. So I start to have more increasing support. But it was not easy at the beginning. So and of course, now I'm integrating technology as well. But we need to remember that there is no school of fine art. For example, I wanted even to create a course on dance and movement at Georgia Tech. So I also want a student to experience self-expression through their body, because I think it's very important. If you look at artists like Picasso, or there are some videos, if you look at them making art, they're not using just their hand, they're using the entire body. So, the entire body is completely basically dedicated, to create art. And so, and for example, I remember at the beginning, some of the students, they are very constrained. They basically they were working on their little space. So like confinement, I don't know, maybe due to previous bad experiences, someone that told them that they're not good in doing art and so on. But then, over the semester, I can see them basically open up, and so they feel the space is safe, is welcoming, and they can completely free express themselves. So I mean, to be truly creative, you need a free mind with no constraint and no. And that's why yes, I talking about AI. What is missing in AI? AI is not a being in the world. This Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, he basically was the one that criticized basically AI. That it's not a being in the world like we are, and so to be creative, the interaction with other people, the immersion into the world around us, the immersion into nature, into feeling what is the things around us, it makes a huge difference. And it can make us more creative. And I think, we don't know I don't know. Is there any studies about the psychology and neuroscience of creativity? So how basically, the external stressor can affect, the ambiental stressor can affect the creativity of a person. I talked to philosophy at Georgia Tech and at what is the school indicator. Oh my gosh, I have a blackout now. What is the school indicator, Anna?
I'm not at Georgia Tech, so I can only guess.
It's the liberal arts school.
Oh, liberal arts school, okay.
I thought, oh my God, I'm very bad. So I have some friend there, also a philosopher. So what is creativity? How you define creativity?
Emory.
No, it's not Emory. It's
okay.
Agnes Scott.
Agnes Scott, okay.
What is creativity? So how you define?
Well, I'm glad Rosa started with this, where she started to talk about definitions. And, I think partly all of you are getting it slightly, and maybe we can open up the discussion here, to think about assessing creativity from, what is not using AI has increasingly led to questions about what is novel. I think Rosa's talked about this a little bit. There's one question there: who owns the art? So if you've done it, this is if you've used AI to sort of generate this. There's more practical, maybe economic considerations, if you'd have it, of whose intellectual property is it? How do we value it? I think Daniela spoke to that a little bit. But when you think about how we define creativity, it has a lot to do with, again, theoretical approaches. My approach would be to distinguish between the
Francesca, what you were doing in class, which is train people's internal perspective and think about, what you said about discovery, I don't quite agree with, because for me, discovery is the process of finding. So it's a very active process, just because there's a difference between having information being somewhere, whether it's online or in a encyclopedia. It doesn't matter. The process of discovery is a very intrinsic one, and that's key to the creative process. Whereas a lot of creativity, I think, from the geographical approach, economic approach, is all about how it's valued by others. And so there's quite a different space here between the internal perspective of the creator and what happens to what they have made and the way it's viewed at from the outside. So these are quite separable. They are related, but they're quite separable. But I think a lot of confusion comes from not separating them, if you know what I mean, which is like not seeing the process as separable from the product. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, all three of you really, and Kimberly actually as well.
Maybe I can start, because I had about this discovery actually, because I did ask from my participants also this question, although it did not end up being so fundamental to my work, but I did ask them, do they think AI can be creative, or what they think of it as, kind of AI experts also. And many of them refer to this, exactly this imagination or discovery, that because AI can't experience discovery, it can't be deemed as creative. No matter how intricate the processes we could model on AI, then it just, because it doesn't kind of distinguish, or it can't understand what actually is a discovery and what not, because for AI, all outputs are of equal value. The value is only determined afterwards by us humans. So that would make AI not creative. But when it comes to defining creativity in general, I think there can be different perspective, because what might be a discovery for you personally might not be a discovery for the society. So again, I guess there's a question of scale as well. Like, what do we see it from the societal perspective, or do we see it from the inside? And I think in creativity research, they have distinguished this with kind of this little c, big C creativity. Some scholars like Margaret Bowden have used this. So kind of big C creativity is what is creative for the society as a whole, and little c is what is creative for you in your everyday life. So I think that can also be a way to look at it if you want to see these scales.
So if I can elaborate a bit more on that, I had no time to show you, but we also asked ChatGPT to evaluate the creative answers by humans and by ChatGPT, basically. And so what we found is that unless you give ChatGPT very specific instructions, again, on how to, let's say, unpack creativity scores, and we used, again, originality, elaboration, and nonsense, then basically what we found is that there was no difference across our treatments, and ChatGPT was very generous in assigning scores, and basically almost assigned the same scores to any creative output. So if you just say assign a score for 1 to 10 on reflecting how do you think this answer is creative, I mean, it was not very informative for ChatGPT, and ChatGPT was not able to, let's say, assign a score that made any sense. But once you specify what you mean for creativity, then we had scores that were reflecting a lot those given by humans. So again, probably also ChatGPT needs to be trained, or at least informed in the moment you ask it to do this evaluation for what we think creativity is, because it's not clear for us, and it's even worse for a machine that may, let's say, ground its evaluation on a huge amount of different data. So this is a bit of my experience, and it made me reflect a lot on the fact that now AI used a lot to evaluate, for instance, curricula for workers and so on. So I know that many firms have this initial phase of screening job applications using AI, and so I think it's crucial to understand which are the specific instruction and prompts that are given to ChatGPT, because if you give the wrong indication, then also the evaluation is totally biased based on the prompts, and also biased based on the data that ChatGPT or AI has been trained on. So this is another extremely interesting point. I've seen in the chat that someone was commenting on the definition. I used the one by Mumford that saying that creativity needs to be considered. The creative output needs to be evaluated as creative by peers in its usefulness. That's true. Someone was saying that it's a very, let's say, limited scope, and I totally agree with that. In fact, in the paper or in general in the discussion we had, this useful was considered in a much wider sense. So useful also in the sense of being something that is giving a contribution, so not just useful in terms of the uses you can give, because of course in this case all is related to art might be not perceived as useful in a very strict sense. So again, among the many possible definitions, we use that, but also, let's say, giving to the term useful a very broad sense in terms of being considered as creative in a wide sense, because our idea was having other people recognize one creative output as creative or not, and that's why we involved many judges in order to have an idea of evaluation may vary across judges. So we also take into account the variance in the evaluation, not only the average, exactly for that.
Bring up a question that was offered by Brian Stolman, and this might go to Daniela in particular, but I'd be interested in hearing from anybody. So yes, something my students continue to bring up as we lean into AI for everyday mundane tasks. How might we address the issue that it's using so much of our natural resources to operate? Sorry. Right, so there's a lot of environmental costs to using AI and to training it and to keep building these and to storing the data. And we might also say that it's often disproportionately, the brunt of this is disproportionately borne by people who are already marginalized, typically. Do any of you have thoughts, but I think kind of this is related to Daniela's research in particular, on how we should manage that?
Daniela, do you want to continue? Because I have background in geography, so I have a lot of thoughts about natural resources and how we should use them. And I think this is an extremely important question. And I think one of the things that bothers me a lot with not just AI, but a lot of with digital technologies is kind of if we don't see the kind of burden on natural resources, because it can be quite invisible almost. We just think that all of these resources just like exist somewhere, like ChatGPT exists in some cloud, and like even calling the cloud makes it sound like it's like somewhere out there, but actually all of this is coming from somewhere, and like the amount of water and electricity these models use is enormous. And now we are already starting to see problems, as you probably know, like in some countries when some regions have this urge to sell land or sell these electricity to these companies that like data centers and so on. Then there is not enough electricity for the local people and so on. And yeah, I think it's definitely something we should like really ask ourselves, like, do we really need this? Especially, I think the question had about these mundane tasks. Like, I am now referring back to my own work. What I found when these people talked about their own creative processes, even though, yeah, the mundane work sometimes feels really boring, like when you do whatever work, like it can be like, oh, I don't want to do the mundane, but often the mundane is also a fundamental part of being creative. Because how do you recognize creativity in your own work if you don't have those periods of mundane, boring tasks? And often the boring can actually be really useful for your brain to just to like, cool down and I don't know, just to not be in this like active mode of creating the whole time. Like you sometimes also need the mundane. So I understand the kind of perspective of using AI to do the boring stuff, but I would like to push back to that a bit by saying that sometimes it's also good for us as individuals to do boring stuff. And also if the kind of outsourcing the boring stuff to AI means that we are also using our natural resources to exhaustion, I don't know if it's worth it. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I have another experiment, not with AI, but on creativity. And there we have people deciding to, let's say, engage with the closed tasks, the less creative, let's say, and others may decide to go with the more creative task. And I was surprised, but many people decided to deal with the less creative one because somehow it's less, I don't know, risky, or they need to put less effort. They just stay there and do something. Of course, it's in the situation of an experiment. It's not everyday life, but it's effort consuming, time consuming, be always creative. So I totally agree with you that probably we need both, and we appreciate being creative because I mean, we see the difference. And I also have to say that sometimes routine tasks teach us something. So maybe for older people, sorry, we did many, and so we need less. But for younger people, also learning to be precise, learning to correct their mistakes by themselves. I think, for instance, about coding, I always use AI to correct my coding because I'm bored, to close parentheses and so on. But I mean, if you start coding directly using AI, you basically don't learn because you just say, okay, tell me how to do this and so on. So this learning process, I mean, has some value. And if someone else is doing it for you, you lose this value. So yeah. And of course, all these shortcomings are exacerbated by the fact that it has a huge cost. And I think we need to have some course of AI literacy everywhere. Literacy about the cost of AI, literacy about the stereotypes that AI diffuses. I just ran a small test with my students a few days ago, and they basically had to pick an image created by AI among many that was to represent a robot engaging with everyday things in the house, and the majority of them chose an image with a female aspect. And so I mean, the AI prepares all the images you picked. You don't even think about this issue that can be affected by stereotypes. The AI was presenting a majority of female, let's say, robots, and then they went picking them without even reasoning about them. So, yeah, I think stereotypes and sustainability and all these consequences in terms of cost are aspects that need to be addressed as soon as possible.
That actually leads to another question I was going to ask, and this could be for any of you. I expect it might not apply to Francesco as much, but some of the work I've been doing is I can get most of the models to start talking about gendered nouns in English within about 10 prompts. Pretty, in some cases as fast as one. So I was interested to see, which you just mentioned, cases where you're seeing stereotypes or biases, gendered, racial, ethnic, or anything that has come up as you've been exploring or experimenting with these, because they're pretty known issues. And while they've put up guardrails so that they're no longer saying directly offensive things, we're still, I think, seeing a lot of these associations that come up. And I'm just curious to see what have come up in any of your work.
Well, I can, from my part, say, not necessarily in my work, but just in general, because I also teach a lot, and this is a whole another discussion, but like how to, since it seems that universities are now encouraging us, like teachers and students, to use AI, so then I try to teach how they should interpret the results by not just taking everything at face value. And I think one of the good things, or like that I have discovered, or kind of that I can often use, is that we, at least in my university, we use Microsoft Copilot, and I know a lot of other universities use that also, or then ChatGPT. And these are basically the US-based models, and often the data that they have been trained with is from the US, or at least it's like English or Anglo-American context, but we are a Finnish university. So then I always ask, like, how well do you think this model can represent us Finns? And then let's go even further, like take another country where maybe there's not so much text available even, or some region that doesn't have so much written text, or people who are not represented in written text, especially maybe not in English. So I have found that students often understand this, that like this kind of, these models offer a perspective to the world that is coming through a very specific lens, and they should know that, so they can't just treat it as this like God-given like facts, but it's like filtered through so many lenses, and we should like try to understand that. And maybe you can even try to teach it by like making them ask. I don't know how easy this is in like the US context, because then I guess for you it's like more, if you are there, like it's a bit harder to like find this, but like maybe you can just then use an example just from like this discrimination perspective, or kind of if you are not seen as the default person in society, like how can you like are represented through these models. But yeah, I think those have really opened up the eyes of at least some of my students to understand, like, hey, like this model does not actually know anything about my home, like how things are here in my city, in which is not in this like Anglo-American context, or at least the view it produces, it's very from that perspective. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think there is ways to teach this, but I think it takes kind of, we have to first take the mask off, not just like trust blindly these models, and understand that they are kind of products of the environment where they have been developed.
You had another question, right, Kimberly? Or do you want to ask that? Or is it related?
I do. This one might be a little bit more, and now I'm blanking on whose research I was thinking it might result from, but well, about people and their self-perception of creativity, I think. I don't know if you've all seen the Meter study. METR is the group. Hasn't been published, it's a preprint, but it looks pretty decent. And they took a bunch of software developers and asked them how much they felt that their generative AI use helped their productivity. And the average was like, they thought it helped them increase their productivity by like 40%. So then they gave them a task. And they did the task without the help of AI first, and then, or I'm not sure the order, but then also did it with AI. And after the task, the programmer said, okay, this task can only help me about 20%. Right? But the actual measurement was that they were 10% slower, 10% less productive. So that I wonder if any of you have been exploring that, our self-perception of, and I assume with the software developers, it's because they have a page of code immediately, and that just feels so good. but then the time they have to spend to fix it, they lose any benefit of having started with something. Do you all have any insight or thoughts, or have had discussions with your students about the degree to which the AI may or may not be helping them be creative, or how their self-perception of this may or may not be actually accurate?
Francesco, maybe you've had that? Because they have to use AI to you deal directly with teaching them to code?
In my case, I mean, I don't make students to use the ChatGPT. So they create, they do simple algorithms, and they code everything from scratch. They get their own data. So, but I mean, even with regular ChatGPT, I mean, again, student, man, each of us, they have to gain a critical assessment, So you need to, every time you get an output from ChatGPT, you need to be able to criticize and say, oh, is it giving me a good answer? Can I use it? Is it helpful? So, because, another things with ChatGPT, if you repeat asking question on the same chat that you open, so what happened, ChatGPT, every time you write a new prompt, it will also account for all the previous prompt that you wrote. And so eventually, then if you decide to change topic and you're still using the same chat, so what happened, the answers, they get polluted by all the previous prompts. So you have to basically start a new chat. And so in order to reset so, they are, there is a learning curve, one has to really understand how this system work, and basically, it become like prompt engineering. So how to be able to write, because professional programmers nowadays, they don't program anymore. What they do now, they write very accurate prompts, and they make sure that Claude, because now most of the things is done on Anthropic Claude, is doing what they want them to do. So, and so it's all about, becoming more critical, be able to have a critical assessment of the output. Is it giving me a good output? Should I, and I like to use, in my class, we use AI in a state of weakness. We really push in, under training, low amount of data, hallucination states. So we try to really push the system and see how much can I hallucinate. And sometimes, it come up with some very things that are creative. So artistically, they have some qualities, which then students jump in and recreate it in their own way. So they put a human touch. And so, or they provide missing information, images that they miss colors, or they are incomplete, and then students jump in and, they can make a painting out of it and reinterpret it. So, and so maybe, this will be going back to ChatGPT, so, there is a research, that distinguish between memorization and generalization. So, because there is truly ChatGPT, is really learn his own way to understand English, understand mathematics, and then he's able to combine it in such a way to provide even new answers and new. So, and this will be the generalization part. So I'm working on try to understand how a transformers is able to learn basically semantic rules, how is able to learn to do mathematics. And it is true, yes, it is a statistical approach, so, but there is something more than that. And I think, there is still an ongoing research to really understand how ChatGPT, is able to answer you in English, or in any other language, or solve, write a program for you, or solve a mathematical expression. this is more than something statistical. I mean, so definitely, so these machines, they are able to learn structure. I give you an example. For example, so there was a famous physicist, in the 70s, it's called Dirac, that he was trying to come up with an extension of mathematical models that would account for the effect of relativity. And then, he was studying this equation, and then he found a problem. He got stuck into this problem. And then, he made a connection. So he remembered that, when I was a student, he was in a library and looked at this book about group theory. And he remembered that, there was this spatial manipulation of matrices. And so with this connection, then he used it, to elaborate a new model that now is called the Dirac equation. So basically now is this basically creativity? And so no, he basically, he had already some knowledge, and he has some memory of this concept, and then he was able to make this long range connection in his brain between some theory that he was dealing with, and then these memories when he was a student from this book in the library. So ChatGPT is really good at this. So because when you do the training on the data set, what these transformers do, they basically find all the possible long-range dependencies among all this data. But they do it even at a deeper level, in abstract sense, only trying to find the semantic relationships, mathematical. We don't know, so it's still very unclear.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, is this creativity? I mean, when you are able to connect different fields of some knowledge that you already have, and you are able to connect it to come up with something new, is this creativity? Is from a neuroscience perspective? Because ChatGPT is really good at this. That's what, again, he already, because he's able to figure it out, all the possible relationships between all the data beyond the human capabilities. So, he's able to see through the data more than a human does. So is this creativity? So every time, when we come up with connections, so I always thought that when you're able to come up with a connection from different fields, that's where new discovery comes, And but I mean, it's just a connection, or truly creativity? How would you?
I think I would love to leave it on that because we are out of time, but Federico and I will continue the discussion after this for sure. But I think it's a good prompt to leave it on because, again, it's talking about how those associations are made.
Yes.
And it is, I would think of it as a lot of people would say it's not creative, but a lot of people would say it is. It just has nothing, it's not really similar to what we do at all. It's its own thing. So there's whole fields that talk about artificial creativity. But again, contentious. Some people think this way or that way. But I think it's a good prompt to end on. I'm sorry we have to bring it to a close, but thank you so much to all the session speakers for the first session. We had 3 different perspectives from 3 different disciplines: geography, economics, engineering, and art, and a lot more with Kimberly here as a philosopher as well. Thank you all for being here. Our next session starts in a little less than an hour. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much to everyone.